So we are still in our series that we're calling Do the Opposite. And I got to say that it's great to see how some of you are really taking this to heart and letting God lead you in different ways. But there's one that just really stands out to me. And so have a look. Right? So we're having a little fun, but whether you're at the bowling alley or where you work or where you live, there is this life that God has called us into to follow Him, and it often feels opposite to what feels normal to us in this world. So we've been taking some time to just kind of open that up and see more clearly this life that Jesus is calling us to live. And as we do that, and we're looking at Jesus and what He wants from us, we've kind of had to compare ourselves against what Jesus has, and we're kind of rating where we are to where He wants us to be, and that helps us to see more clearly what God wants and to be able to take these faith steps. And hopefully you've been doing that as we kind of do the opposite from what we've always maybe done, and instead now we're choosing to follow Jesus. Now, I don't know if you've seen this or if this kind of impacts you, but have you noticed how often you're asked today to fill out surveys? Have you noticed that? Right? And so maybe you see something like this, and you go into a restaurant and they're like, how would you rate your satisfaction? And you get to kind of pick your smiley face and maybe the words that describe your experience at that restaurant or at that business. Here's one that we all love to see, right? And so how would you rate your pain? Right? Point to the smiley face of how you're feeling in this moment when you go into the hospital. And I got to tell you, if I'm in the hospital, I'm always over here, man. I'm never coming over there because it's no hurt. So I don't know why they just don't start it at like 5 and go on down. But maybe it's because they want to see if you're feeling better while you're there. Or here's this one. How would you rate this app or this product or this business? By the way, this is our Google page, so if you could just pull out your phone right now and give us 5 stars, that would be great. Like us on Facebook, right? I'm just kidding. But we're constantly being bombarded by surveys, aren't we? Help us out, rate us, grade us, evaluate us, and it's always with this kind of graduated, scale, everything in between, stars or faces. And okay, but what would we do if we took this idea and we applied it to our lives in a spiritual sense, right? This rating and this evaluating. Not of other people or not of something else, but what if we just looked at ourselves for a moment? And so here's the topic. How well we listen to God. And I even put a scale together for you today to help us, evaluate where we are. This is custom for me, right? So if you wonder what I do through the week, this took me at least an hour. Right? I know. Sad, isn't it? How well do you listen to God? And so, would you say, what? I am under the good angel. That's where I'm always listening to God. I always respond to everything He asks me to do. Or would you be like, what? My halo's kind of slipping, and I try to listen to God, but sometimes I miss it, right? Or, what? I kind of have to confess, Kirk, I don't listen as much as I should, but I feel bad about it, man. I'm sad devil, right? I'm kind of hovering about here. Or maybe I'm bad to the bone, right? I don't listen, and I don't plan to start listening anytime soon, right? This is kind of where I'm hanging out. Or maybe you're like somewhere, in between. But when it comes to God, where would you place yourself when it comes to how well you listen, right? And does a graduated scale, does that even work when it comes to how well we listen? Just hang with me for a moment, because it seems to me that the true test of whether someone listens is always found in how they respond. How they respond. And so, for example, when your spouse asks you to pick up something from the store, right, the mark of whether we've really listened is if we bring that item home with us, or we leave it at Walmart, right? And so that determines whether or not we really listened, right? When you ask your kids to do their chores or to do their homework, right, the mark of whether or not they really listened is if they do it or they fail. to get it done. That shows you whether or not they listen to you. When we face that evaluation at work and we've got to sit down with your boss or with your supervisor and you've got to comb over things, right? One of the measures of whether you're a good employee is how well you listen, and how they grade that is by how well you respond to what is asked of you or what has been said to you, right? How well we listened. Listening it's just not an area where we seem to get partial credit. And I think we get that. And yet when it comes to God, man, we try to live as if there's this graduated scale of listening and responding. And let me show you what I mean. So throughout this series, we've been looking at the life of King Saul from the Old Testament. He's the first king of Israel, and what we've noticed, right from the bat, is that Saul is not really a good role model for us to look up to, right? He just does some things that just are not right, and we see he's resisting God, or he's moving in these kind of impulsive ways that are just based on how he feels in the moment, what's best for him in the moment. He often fails to seek God, and more than that, he really fails to listen to God. And because of that, Saul's life becomes one disaster after another. And even moments like today that we're going to look at, or the last couple of weeks where we've seen this battle with the Philistines, even moments where it looks like Saul's doing well, right? Things begin to unravel all around him, all because Saul fails to listen to God. Right? And so over the last few weeks, we've been looking at this one moment, this one battle given to us that Saul's engaged in against this enemy nation called the Philistines. We're actually moving on from that. That's chapters 13 and 14, and we're getting into 1 Samuel chapter 15 today. And it's another battle. Saul's always struggling with something, right? But this time it's against a group called the Amalekites that we read about there. And here's how the moment kind of opens up for us in 1 Samuel chapter 15. So Samuel said to Saul, "Now I'm the one the Lord sent to anoint you as king." Samuel's this great prophet, remember? I was the one the Lord sent to anoint you as king over his people Israel. So now listen to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now just pause there. Because for most of us, we're not really up on our Jewish history, and that's okay. I struggle to keep up with American history, and I live here, right? I'm like, okay, but let's just kind of set this up. So we know that God freed the Israelites from Egypt. Most of us know the story of the Exodus. We've seen movies or we've seen pictures of that, and we've talked about that. And he leads them from Egypt through the desert, across the Red Sea, like through it, to this place that we call Mount Sinai, or sometimes we call it Mount Horeb. It's two names for the same mountain. And on the way, as they're traveling through the desert, the Israelites encounter the Amalekites. It's this kind of tribal group, and they happen to be cousins of the Israelites, okay? But they're not friendly cousins. In fact, the Amalekites hated the Israelites, and I mean they hated them with a passion. And so if you think of what Hitler and Nazi Germany did to the Jews, and you were to multiply that exponentially, now you're getting to the level of hatred that the Amalekites have for the Israelites, right? All they wanted to do was just wipe them out. That's what they're driven by. That's what they're consumed with, is this hatred for the Israelites. Now their hatred actually began years and years ago, about 400 years before they meet in this moment. And it starts with this battle between two twin brothers. And you probably remember the biblical story of Jacob and Esau, right? There are these twins, and Jacob is from where the line of Israel comes from, because God renames Jacob Israel, and then his children become the Israelites. And out of Esau, his grandson is actually Amalek, who then is the head of the Amalekites. Okay, so you're tracking the family lines now, right? And it's hatred that started with these two brothers that has now been driving for generations the Amalekites towards the Israelites. And now the Israelites are fresh out of Egypt. They're slaves that have been freed, and they're making their way to this mountain to worship God. And on their way, now they're being attacked by their cousins. God moves and helps them to defend themselves and kind of drive back the Amalekites temporarily. And then they just continue on their way, and that's really all that we hear about them in that moment. Now, Fast forward about 400 years in history, and we're to the time of King Saul, who we've been kind of focusing on, right? And during that time, things have not simmered down at all. In fact, the hatred of the Amalekites, if anything, it's just grown deeper, larger, more volatile, right? And they just moved constantly now, and they're to the south of the nation of Israel, and they just kept moving and attacking these defenseless little villages all across the southern border, and what we would call terrorist attacks. The Amalekites have only become a tool of Satan, driven by their hatred, driven by their sin, as they just try to destroy God's people, and they're trying to destroy God's plan to save the world. Okay, so this is who they are. With that backdrop in place, it makes verse 3 that I'm about to show you a little bit easier for us to swallow. Okay, but this is what we read. Now go, God says to Saul, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. That word destroy literally means devote all of that to God. Right? This is going to be God's. Don't take anything. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Okay? That's the command that God gives Saul. And I get that when you read that, you're like, wow, that is some harsh stuff. Okay? And it is. Okay, but here's the deal. God is not being cruel, and God is not being unfair, and God is not being vengeful in this moment. It's easy to read that and think that, but that's not what's going on. Actually, God has been extending grace to the Amalekites for over 800 years. Right? He's been trying to call them to him. He's been speaking to them. He's been trying to draw them to himself, get them to turn around, but they refuse to listen. They refuse to respond. They refuse to repent and turn away from their sin. And so here's the deal. While it makes us uncomfortable, we belong to a God who deals with sin. Okay? Now, we love to talk about how loving and how gracious God is. And boy, he is, right? He is loving and gracious. And the greatest move of that we see is this grace poured out on us in Jesus, who died and rose from the dead to set us free from sin and help us to turn to him. And we love that. Okay, but we also know that God isn't just a God of grace and love, but he's also a God of justice. And what we mean when we say that is that he's a God who moves against sin and takes what is wrong and makes it right. Right? This is what God's purpose is in that moment. And we love that. We love that God is a God of justice when we've been wronged. We love it, right? When we're the victim of someone else's sin, or because we live in a sin-scarred world and some of that just kind of falls on us and it's not our fault, and we cry out to God, oh God, this is not right, this is wrong, this has been done to me. And we love it when God moves in justice in our lives and he takes what is wrong and he makes it right. Right? We love it when he moves like that. Okay, but what makes us uncomfortable is when we're in the wrong. When we're the ones that are wrapped up in sin, and then God moves to make things right. Okay, because here's the danger. When we're wrapped up in sin and we refuse to let God free us from it, we face his justice instead of his grace. You with me? And we find ourselves in that moment when we refuse to let God unravel sin from our lives. When we face his justice, we find ourselves destroyed by our own decision to embrace sin instead of God. Okay? And so I just have to tell you, there's no graduated scale here. You're either embracing one or the other. Right? There's no in-between ground where I can try to hold on to God and embrace my sin at the same. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work. Okay? And so in this moment with the Amalekites, God's not being cruel or vengeful or unfair at all. He's been moving in grace for over 800 years to try to get this group of people who come from a line that knows who he is. Okay? It's not that they're completely ignorant here, right? They know about God. They've been taught to, right? He's been trying to move for 800 years to get them to turn around and look to him. But now it's time to move in justice and bring an end to sin. Okay? And that end is really what we all deserve. We call it death. Now, move with me here, because if death is what we all deserve because of sin, your sin and my sin, if death is what we all deserve, that's what the Bible clearly tells us, right? Then the only reason you and I are alive and moving today is because we belong to a God of incredible grace and mercy and patience, right? He's putting up with me on my worst day, and He's putting up with you on your worst day in the hopes that He could speak into your life and turn you around to embrace Him. Okay? He's constantly trying to get us to turn away from sin and turn to Him in this amazing life that He has for us. He's calling to us, and He wants us to listen. Okay, so that's a rather long explanation because sometimes we just get caught up on verses like verse 3 here, and I don't want us to kind of get caught up on that. Now, if you still have questions, it's fine. Just come and talk to me, and we can have a little bit more conversation one-on-one sometime. But let's get back into this moment, okay? So, Samuel comes to Saul, and he says to him, "Listen now to the message from the Lord." Now, literally, in the Hebrew language, it's a little more wordy, right? And so this is kind of, if we were to just kind of do a transliteration, okay? Hear now the voice of the words of the Lord. Again, it's kind of redundant, right? But it's important to see what's going on here because this idea of hearing God's voice is really key to understanding chapter 15 of 1 Samuel. Okay? And really, this is what God longs for all of us to be able to do, is to hear His voice. In fact, this is where we begin as far as really listening is involved. To really listen to God means hearing God's voice. Hearing God's voice. Now, I get it. I talk about this a lot because my goal for all of you is to hear God's voice better today than you did yesterday, and better tomorrow than you do today, right? And just to keep growing in hearing Him and knowing Him. And it's this foundational truth, and I'm going to hit it time and time again until the day that God calls me home, okay? Because this is so important. You and I are constantly being bombarded with all kinds of voices all around us in our lives, right? So we've got the voice of friends who speak into our lives, and you know what? They influence us. And sometimes it's for good things, and sometimes it's not so good, right? Okay, we've got the voice of culture that is constantly telling us, hey, this is what you should believe, and this is what you should hold as right, and this is what you should hold as wrong. And I don't care what that Bible stuff says. This is what you should believe, and this is what's popular, and this is what's not, and this is what you should aim for in your life. This is how you know you've got value and worth, and you've arrived, and right? And that's a voice of culture. We've got voices from our past, and sometimes they encourage us, and we've got great people that have been with us, through the years, but sometimes those voices move in negative ways, and they kind of heap shame on our lives. We've got things like the voice of self-indulgence, which I don't know about you, but every time I drive by Dairy Queen, it's like, order the large Blizzard. Right? That's that voice speaking into my life. Skip the gym, just relax tonight, right? That's that voice of self-indulgence. And in the mix of all of those voices in our lives, we've got the voice of the enemy, and he's constantly condemning us. He's constantly lying to you. He's constantly trying to steer you away from following God, right? And so all of these and more are constantly calling out to you and to me as we kind of go throughout our day, and where you work or where you go to school, or as you listen to music or as you watch TV or when you get online. We are just saturated by all of these voices. And I got to tell you, sometimes it's just really hard, isn't it? To hear the one voice that matters above all other voices, right? The voice of God in your life and in mine. I like how one person put it, and he said this: good listening is like tuning in to a radio station. Remember when we had analog tuners and you had to kind of fine-tune that puppy? Now it's all digital, and people are like, tuning in, I just pressed the button, Kirk, it's not a problem. No, it used to be this bar, and you'd have to fine-tune that puppy to get it into that radio station. I'm 42. I can say old-timey things now, and you have to deal with it, right? When you try to listen to more than one station, and we've all been there, as you end the zone of one and you start hearing the other, there's this spot around Peru where I kind of get a Mexican flavor mixed in with my Christian music out of Fort Wayne, and so for a while it's just kind of, man, it's happening, man, right? But really what you hear when you got that bleed over is it's distortion, right? And it's confusion, and it's chaos. You can't hear either one clearly. And so knowing the challenge that we face, let me just ask you, what are you doing to tune out the distractions in life so that you can better tune into the voice of God in your life? And I'm not talking about, you don't have to quit your job. I'm not telling you to do that. I'm not telling you to sell your house. I'm not telling you to go live in some convent or some monastery in some, remote mountainous range, where you can just kind of commune with God and be away from it. No. That's not realistic. At least it's not for me. If it's for you and it works for you, go for it, man, right? But it's not realistic for me. So what are you doing where you live, here and now, to tune into the voice of God in your life? Right? And I get that we're doing that right now in this moment, okay? But what do you do throughout the week? Between now and next Sunday when we gather together and we look to God together, what do you do to make space in your life to hear God's voice? Because making space to hear God's voice, man, it's so important. In fact, it's actually something Jesus himself models for us. Here's just one glimpse that we see from Mark 1:35. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Right? And so you can find other passages just like this where Jesus' disciples are like, where'd he go? Right? And it's early in the morning usually, and it's often this, isolated, remote place. And so they're like, okay, don't check Starbucks. Jesus never goes there. Go to this back alley because that's where Jesus hangs out, is this remote place. And so they go and they find him, right? But let's just pause here and let me open, if I can, this up for us because Jesus models for us what we need to do in our lives. Okay, so Jesus found time that worked for him and for God very early in the morning. Before the busyness of life began, before the demands of life began to stir in his life, Jesus found this time when he could best tune in to the voice of his heavenly Father and listen. Okay? And so to follow Jesus means finding a time that works for us and God, okay? A time when your alert and distractions are limited. A time when you can kind of get by yourself for just a little bit. And so sometimes that's first thing in the morning. I tell you that's what works for me, right? Before the family is stirring, before the workload kind of begins, before the busyness of the day begins to fill up all the space of time on my plate, right? That's what works for me is first thing in the morning. Maybe for you, the best part of your day is part of your lunch break. And maybe it's sometime during the day when your kids take a nap or after you put them to bed, it's later at night, the house is a little more quiet. But find a time when distractions are limited. Okay, that's what we're looking for. This is what we're also told. Jesus, he got up and he left the house and he went off to a solitary place. Jesus didn't just find a time that worked, but Jesus found a space that limited distractions from his life. So where is that for you? Right? Maybe it's a particular room in your house. Maybe it's sitting in your car over your lunch break instead of hanging out with everybody, at work. And maybe it's not so much about a particular place, but it's about guarding that space and that time from unnecessary distractions. A big distraction that a lot of us face today is with our phones, right? They could be a huge blessing. I live on my phone. I don't know what I'd do without it. It is my memory. It's my appointments, right? It's how I email all of you or text you back or call you, right? I'm constantly on that thing. But you know what? It can also be a big distraction. Man, that notification light starts flashing, and you just want to check out what's going on, right? Did they like my post? Who's texting me now? What's going on? Right? And you see that blinking light. Many of us are not disciplined enough to just ignore it. And it becomes a distraction. So, right, if that's you, just get your phone out of your zone, put it down, turn it over, turn it off, just for a little bit. It's all about finding and guarding this space and limiting distracting voices from our lives so that we can better hear the voice of God. Okay, that's what we're talking about. Okay, the last part we're told that Jesus did is that he prayed, right? And really that's the best way for you and I to begin too, right? Before you begin reading in your Bible, before you open your devotional book, just ask the Holy Spirit to help you, right? Turn to him and, Holy Spirit, I just need to hear from you today. I know that you want to speak into my life, and so help me not to be distracted. I got a lot on my mind. Help me to just give that to you, and help me to just hear from you what you want to say into my life in this moment. Okay, then you start reading your Bible. Then you start reading your devotional book. Okay, but you're not reading it just for information, right? These tools are some of the best ways that God speaks into our lives. And so read it and listen as if you're having a conversation with God, okay? And so if you have questions, ask God. God, I got a question about this. Can you clarify this for me? Can you guide me to the right person that can help me have the answer? And when you're encouraged by what you read, man, this is a great promise. God, thank you for this promise. Or when you're challenged, God, okay, I get it. Man, I feel your thumb in my back on this issue. I know that I've got to move. And so I just want to thank you for caring enough to speak into my life and help me to make this change, right? Now, if this deal of making space and hearing God every day is new to you, this is what I tell you. Start small, right, and grow, right? And so begin maybe by giving God just 10 minutes every day. Just 10 minutes. You can do this. It's just maybe during your 15-minute break at work, whatever that works for you, just 10 minutes. Make this space to tune into God, to listen for his voice, because as he moves in your life, I guarantee you're going to want to give him more time to speak into your life, because this is how it works, right? Now, here's the deal. If the perfect Son of God needed alone time with God the Father to hear his voice, how much more do we need it? Right? And so if you find yourself struggling here, if you're not doing this, can I just encourage you today to maybe do the opposite of what you've been doing and make this space and time for God to speak into your life, right? And just watch as God transforms not just your life, but he starts to transform your family as you just keep giving him more space to work. Okay, so this is where listening to God begins. We're going to make this time daily to hear God's voice. And the next step is this. To really listen then also means trusting God, trusting his heart. Trusting his heart. That he knows what's best, that he wants what's best for you, what's right for us, and that he longs to lead us into what is best for us. And again, it's this foundational truth that we often know in our heads, but we don't always believe in our hearts. And this is where Saul struggled as well. In fact, let's just kind of jump back into this. 1 Samuel chapter 15, beginning in verse 7. Okay, so then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur near the eastern border of Egypt. And he took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all of his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul, say those two words with me, but Saul and the entire army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and the lambs and everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was, despised, that we didn't like, that was weak, we totally destroyed all of that, okay? So God commanded, Saul, destroy everything. Turn it all over to me is essentially what God is saying. But Saul spared Agag the king. Because can you imagine how good it's going to look when he drags Agag, alive and in chains, and he drags him through, the capital city for everybody to see how victorious. That's a trophy to show off for sure, right? God commanded Saul, destroy everything. And so Saul and his soldiers, they destroyed all the weak and sick and the animals that they didn't like. They turned all of that over to God, the things they didn't want. But Saul spared the best of the animals. Because this is good stuff, right? And why would God hold out on us from what's good? Right? And so let me just, can I just go theologically deep with you for just a minute? Can you hang with me? Because Saul, in this moment, shows one of the major reasons why you and I sometimes fall into temptation and sin. Saul had a big but in his life. Now, I'm not talking physically. I mean, I don't know, right? Maybe. But spiritually, when it came to God and really trusting, Saul had a big but. Katie says, don't say that. But that will stick with you. But Saul. Man, he knew what God had called him to do, but Saul didn't believe that God knew and wanted what was best. He just failed to trust God with all of his heart. And the truth is, you and I wrestle with this same thing, don't we? Right? And so when we give into the addiction, when we turn away from God and we embrace sin in our lives, it's the same deal. But Saul, but Kirk, but insert your name. We know what God says. Most of us do. Right? And in our heads, we kind of, well, yeah, if I asked you, hey, does God know what he's talking about? Well, sure, Kirk, he knows what he's talking. He's God, right? And he knows what's good. He knows what's best. But in our hearts, man, we don't believe it. We don't really believe that God has what's best ahead of us all the time, that he's leading us to what's best in our lives. We fail to trust God's heart, and the proof is in how we move, how we go through life, because our lives would change if we really believed that God wasn't holding back on us, that he really had what's best ahead of us. But we struggle here, right? I know that God has set up boundaries for relationships and sex and marriage, but I know that God has called me to let go of this unhealthy area of my life or this toxic relationship from my life, but I know that God says that if I live life serving him and seeking him and giving to him, that he will bless my life, he'll provide for all of my needs. But I know that God calls me to love and God calls me to forgive. God's called me to be patient with this person that's driving me nuts, to show kindness to the people who've hurt me. But is God really after what's best for me? We fail to trust his heart. And so, when I'm in that moment, I just wish that there was some way, some proof of God's love for us. If there was just some evidence, right, that I knew he was really committed to you and to me, or if there was just some way to know how far he's willing to go to really bring what's best into your life and mine, if there was just a way to know God's heart beyond all doubt. And God, who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for you and for me, how will he not also, along with Jesus, graciously give us all things? If you ever doubt God's heart, all you got to do is look at Jesus. And what you're going to see is that God has given you everything that he has, and that he'll always give you everything that you need, because he only wants the best for you. And so when God speaks to you and to me, maybe it's time for us to do the opposite and get rid of the big but and drop the excuses and trust his heart. Okay. And then take the next step, even if it's difficult. And we got to respond in obedience, right? Listening is all about the response, right? So let me run through this moment in Saul's life quickly. Now, I would encourage you to read chapter 15, maybe later today or throughout the week. But let me just kind of give you a rundown of what happens here, because our time's kind of short. Samuel goes to confront Saul the next day, after Saul has failed to carry out what God asks him to do. As he finds Saul, Saul's actually making a monument to himself. Right? This is what we do, isn't it? And so he's not worshiping, he's not praising God for the victory. Saul's actually worshiping, kind of himself in this moment. And so when Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you. I've carried out the Lord's instructions." Right? Life is good. Right? To which Samuel then replies essentially, and our translation doesn't really break down the Hebrew quite right, but here's essentially what he says. Saul, man, if you listen to God's voice, then why do I hear the voices of sheep and cattle in the background? Why do you care about their voices more than God's voice? Oh. And Saul begins scrambling. I mean, he's making excuses. He throws the soldiers under the bus. I mean, he does everything, right? He says, but I did obey the Lord. I went on this mission that the Lord assigned me, and I completely destroyed the Amalekites, and I brought back Agag, their king. But it's the soldiers, man. They're so hard to handle sometimes, those soldiers. They took the sheep and the cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God. And this is why, right? It's in order to sacrifice them to the Lord, your God, at Gilgal. No, really, right? We're planning to worship God and offer sacrifices with all of this stuff. I was gonna build an altar, Samuel, but I just thought maybe I should start with a monument to me first. Right? I'm not making this up. We're going to make up for not listening to God. I promise. But Samuel, okay, so we're not hitting perfect angel over here, right? It's not so bad. I mean, okay, so we didn't listen and obey completely. We're kind of, fallen halo angel, a little, maybe got a little more, I don't know. Okay, but we're going to make God happy, and this is what we're going to do some extra religious activities. We're going to sacrifice all of this stuff now, right? And isn't that how we sometimes move? I know that God isn't happy with my choice, but, okay, so I did that. That was wrong. I'll just give a little extra when the offering plate comes by, and I'll do that. I'll give a little more at church. Or I know that God isn't so happy, but, okay, I'll just be kind today to everyone at work, and that will make God happy today. I'll just be kind. I'll read a little more in my Bible. You know what? I'll even go a step further. I'm going to post like 15 Bible verses on Facebook and Instagram today, and I'm going to be an evangelist in cyber kingdom building, right? That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make it all up to God. I'm going to make him happy with some extra religious activities. And that's what we do. And too often we move like Saul when God wants us to do the opposite. He sends Samuel to drop this heavy truth on Saul, and really it's also for us today. And so here's what we read in verse 22. But Samuel replied, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, these extra religious activities, as much as he does in obeying the Lord? To obey is actually better than sacrifices, and to heed, in other words, to listen, is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance is like the evil of idolatry." Let me translate. Disobedience, failing to listen to God, according to God, is the same as if you're engaging in demon worship. Right? That's what divination and idolatry are. It's the worship of demons instead of God. We would maybe pick some different things because maybe we don't wrestle with, I'm not really tempted to worship demons today, right? But maybe we'd pick some different sins that we think are really bad. So disobedience is the same in God's eyes as murder, adultery. Right? Pick the worst sin you can think of, and God views it the same as disobedience. Failing to listen to God is just as damaging, just as destructive. And wow, we don't think of it that way. But now let me just show you from Saul's life, because it wrecked all over his decision to not listen. Right? And so the first thing we see is that not listening destroyed his ability to lead the people of God. God says, I can't even let you be king anymore, because if you're not following me, how are you going to lead other people to follow me? And so God takes the kingdom away from him. And not listening actually destroyed Saul's family. Right? I mean, completely destroyed it. Saul's life just kind of spirals in this out-of-control way, further and further away from God. Just one but Saul after another as he refuses to listen to God until all that's left is just one grandson who becomes crippled in both feet that the next king actually adopts and rescues, right? That's all that's left from Saul's family because of his decision to not listen to God. And Saul's decision nearly destroyed the people of God. Now, you have to read a little bit more in the Bible, but Agag, who Saul spares, somehow he also missed one of Agag's wives, right? And so if you fast forward in history a few hundred years, we come to a guy named Haman in the book of Esther who rose to power, and you can read about him in the book of Esther during that time, and they're in Persian captivity, right? And what we're told is that Haman is an Agite. He's a descendant from Agag, the guy that Saul was supposed to kill but didn't kill right away, right? And so something happened where Agag's able to have kids in that moment, right? And one of those is the line of Haman. And Haman puts in this motion, this plot, to kill all of the Israelites everywhere in the Persian Empire. And he almost succeeds if it weren't for God stepping in. All of it happened because Saul refused to listen to God. Destroyed his life, his family, almost the entire kingdom. Failing to listen to God will always cost you so much more than you ever thought you would have to pay. But today God has given you and me a chance to do the opposite. To open our lives to hear more from God than what we've been doing. To really trust His heart, that He knows what's best, wants what's best, is leading you into what is best and right and good for your life. And now we can respond in obedience, even if that means doing the difficult thing, right? Even if it means humbling myself and apologizing when I don't feel like maybe apologizing. Maybe it means getting out of an unhealthy relationship that you know is just not good for you. You know what God has said to you. Maybe it means setting your pride, on the side, and I'm going to offer forgiveness even and especially if, they don't really deserve it. They haven't even asked for it, but I'm going to let it go, right? Maybe it's taking the step of faith and I'm going to give or I'm going to serve in this way that God is calling me to move. Maybe it's a new thing in your life. Because this is what it means to really follow Jesus. It's not about some graduated scale. It's not about, I'm mostly listening or I'm partially kind of following. It's about choosing to rise up and embrace what we know and what we believe is best, right? And that's to let God lead our lives. Not for me to lead my life or be led around by somebody else, right? And so it's all about listening and faithfully responding in full obedience as we say yes to God. You with me? So what does that next step of listening look like for you? On the back of your bulletin at the bottom, if you've been following along with your notes, it's right there. But if you haven't, there's a space for you, and maybe you just want to write that down. There's something that happens when it's not just something that's in my head, but I actually write it down or I make a commitment. Maybe it's here at the altar. Sometimes it's just by writing it on that bulletin, right? But here's the deal. We believe that we belong to a God that wants to speak into your life and mine. That's what He tells us, right? And so we believe that. And so maybe today God is speaking to you about something specific, something He wants you to do, something He wants you to stop doing, someone He wants you to talk to, whatever that might be. Maybe He's talking to you about taking time to listen more to Him, like what we've been talking about today, right? And so there's a space there. What do you feel in this moment God is speaking to you about in your life? Right? So just take a moment, just write that down as you just kind of let some of what we've been talking digest inside of your heart and soul. And knowing that God is speaking to you about this issue that you're writing down even now, what are you going to do and how will you listen to him? How will you listen? Because it's about that response, right? And so, God, this is what I'm going to do to hear you better. And God, this is what I'm going to do because I trust your heart. And God, this is how I'm going to respond in obedience today, even if it's the hard thing to do, right? Because God longs to lead us and our families into this greater life and destiny than where we are today. Will you listen and will you follow?